Welcome to today's episode of the Indoencers Podcast. Our guest is a Carnatic guitarist who recently released his own self-titled debut album through the one and only Sandeep Chota's music label called Nama Music. The fusion of multiple genres within the single album perfectly encapsulates his rich musical background, which consists of strong exposure to everything from jazz and blues to Hindustani and Carnatic music. Above all though, his playing is reminiscent of one of India's greatest ever musicians, Shri Mandolin Srinivas, who was our guest's guru across many years. To talk about his fascinating journey till date, I am thrilled to be joined today by Abhay Nayampally. Thank you so much for taking the time to come on.
Thank you so much, Nishad, for having me over.
So just to start off, I started this podcast in May of 2020, and that kind of coincides with something that has shaken the world, which is obviously the coronavirus. So inevitably, the opening question to every artist has been, how has this pandemic affected your sort of career as a musician? And I've gotten various different responses. So I'm curious to hear your take. I know you're somebody that was really involved in live performance. So how do you think that the impacts of COVID have impacted your life as a musician?
It's been very interesting, to say the least. When it first started off, I was very sure that this is going to impact all artists, not just me, very negatively, and it has. Across the spectrum, there are a lot of artists who've been impacted very negatively, unfortunately. But in my own personal case, I would say the impact has been quite constructive. Very weirdly, I know, because this is not something that lends itself to a positive outcome. But I was always into live concerts and session work in my classes, and production and composition and everything was really not on the cards for a long time, even though it was there and at the back of my head somewhere. But when the pandemic struck and everything stopped and we were just forced to sit at home, that's when I had to completely reassess everything that I do, everything that I stand for as a musician, everything that I have. Because you're no longer in front of an audience, you're no longer relevant as an artist who performs. So how can we, the question was, how can we still stay relevant? So social media came about. So social media, a lot of interactions with people on social media and trying to grow the Instagram page as much as possible. But then the idea of the album, which was long pending for many years now, it just kind of all fell into place because Sandeep very kindly made that offer, and he said, I would love to produce 2 of your albums. So there's a second one coming now, which would be out in about 5-6 months. So there's still work going on it. But the first one happened, it released in June, on the 10th of June. And that's what took up most of my time. So I realized that, the mental shift went from live performances to thinking in terms of production and thinking in terms of composition. So that was very interesting for me personally, because it was something that I had wanted to do for a long time, but I'd kind of been procrastinating, because like live concerts, and then you come back and then you're like, I'll just do it tomorrow. What the heck? So tomorrow looked very empty when the pandemic struck. So here we are. And I feel like my entire, mental mapping changed with the pandemic. And obviously it has had its negative impacts too, but overall for me on a personal level, it's been quite positive so far. I just want to look at the positives. I'd like to put it that way. I'd like to look at only the positives. So yeah, that's how it's been so far for me. I don't know how it's going to be in the future, but it's been a fun ride so far on a personal level.
Yeah, that's been a common perspective that, the absence of live performances has led people to make their own music. I interviewed playback singer Sasha Tirupati in my last episode, and she said the same thing basically. Now that all of the live performances were off the table, she's working on 2 albums of her own right now, very much along the same lines. So it's interesting to see these parallels. But that aside, let's go from right now all the way back to the beginning. And what I like to do is kind of trace your journey to where you are today. So let's start from the very beginning. And I've read that your journey initially started off with the keyboard after your father got you a small keyboard and he told you not to touch it when he wasn't around. But curiosity took over and you did so anyway. So I suppose my question here is, why do you think you had such an innate curiosity towards music, even at such a young age?
That's an interesting question. I think the thing is, when I was very young, maybe about 2 or 3, I remember music affecting me very emotionally, which was very odd, I would say, for a 2 or 3-year-old, because the emotional spectrum at that age is not really developed. But I remember listening. So the first ever sound of the guitar that I had ever heard in life was John McLaughlin's opening chords on Zakir Hussain's album Making Music. And I remember that very clearly. So I must have been about 2 or 3 at that time. And I refused to go to preschool unless that tape was played for me. I would throw a tantrum, I would bring the house down, I would threaten to set it on fire, etc. And and I remember it had a very, very emotional impact on me. And then I went on to listen to works by Beethoven and Mozart and all. We had these cassettes when I was growing up, and I was very curious about it. I don't know why, but I would just put it on and listen to it. And I remember that it had a very emotional impact on me. Sometimes I don't know why, but I have memories of this. I would just, start tearing up when I listened to this music. For a child of that age, that was very odd. So anyway, I've grown up weird, so I guess that's all part of it. So I think when my dad got me the keyboard, I must have been about 6 or something, 5 or 6 for the first time. And it was this tiny little, I still remember the model. It was a Yamaha synthesizer PSS 480 or something like that. And it was considered one of the best synthesizers of that time. He got this and I saw all these buttons on it, green, blue, red and everything. And I was like, whoa, this is something different. Now this is a toy. This is a toy. I kept all my He-Man and G.I. Joe aside. And then I started tinkering around with it and I started discovering so many things in a span of maybe a year or two about how a certain note on the right gets affected by a certain note on the left. And that's when the concept of harmony first blew my head, because the same note on the right, and if I change the note on the left, it completely changes the color of the note on the right. So it was like, oh my God, what is this? This is something different. This is something new. I mean, obviously there was no one to tell me that this was all just harmonies, and that's how music works. That's the brilliance of music, and that's the magic that music is. We can't explain why it affects us in a certain way, but it does. And I've just come to accept it for what it is now. But that's where it first started off. And then, keyboard was always there. And then I was fascinated by rhythm as a child. So I started playing the tabla. And I was learning tabla for a long time. And I was playing, and I was getting quite serious about it. But then I was around 13 when a friend of mine got this second-hand old guitar with 5 strings on it, rusty strings. I'm pretty sure I needed a tetanus injection after I touched that guitar, but that thing fascinated me so much. I held it for the first time and then went plink plunk, and I was like, whoa, this is something new again. And then there was no looking back from there. The guitar just, it kind of took over my life. I got my own guitar maybe about 7-8 years after that. Till then, I used to just go to my friend's house and just, till the neighbors called. So then I would be sent home. But then I would just, tinker around with the guitar. Initially, it was just very, very random stuff, just trying to, pick up the basic chords. And back when all of this was happening, there was no YouTube and there was no Google. I know I sound like I'm in my 60s right now, but I'm talking about the late 90s and the early 2000s right now. And Google and YouTube had not even made an entry into India back then, the way it is now. So we didn't have, access to these resources which you get now, which is very fortunate. If you want anything, you can just, get anything that you want. But back then it was all trial and error. So I knew the chords on the keyboard, and I would sit with the keyboard and go, okay, so this is a C major. So what would it translate to on the guitar? And that's how I learned my chords, because I was too lazy to go to a teacher for some reason. So that's how I picked up the guitar, and then it went on from there, and then I started listening to a lot of jazz, and I started trying to pick up jazz. A lot of John McLaughlin and Mahavishnu Orchestra and all of that kind of had its impacts on me. So that that was the direction I was going in. But then throughout my life, there's been this, influence of Carnatic music that's always been there with me. My mom used to learn when she was very young, and so she used to teach me these Carnatic compositions when I was very young. I mean, there's a recording of me. I don't have any memory of it, but there's a recording, so it is me. Uh, so yeah, there's a very badly sung Vatapi Ganapatin that exists when I'm just about 4 years old.
We've all been there.
Yeah. I just hope no one finds the recording now. If released, I would be in a lot of trouble. My credibility would be questioned. But so there was that going on. So Carnatic music has always been present in my life, and the first time I heard you, Srinivas ji, my guru, it really something struck very, very deeply within. This was music that connected in a way that had nothing else had connected this strongly before. And I knew I just had to do it. So it was, I guess you could call it a calling, or I don't know what you would term it as. And I started trying to emulate those sounds on the guitar for the first time. This was even before I'd approached him to, formally teach me as a guru. But for about a year or two, I started experimenting with these basic exercises and these basic raga that are part of the syllabus of Carnatic music. So I kind of started picking it up on my own for about a year or two. And then I, plucked up the courage to go and ask him, would you teach this noob some Carnatic music? And he was so kind. He was very, very, I'm very, very fortunate to have had a yes from him. And he was so kind about it. And then I think within a week or two, I left for Chennai. I studied with him. I used to travel between Pune and Chennai. I used to live in Pune back then. And I used to study with him every few months. And he used to give me a lot of material to kind of practice and to kind of listen to and think about and stuff like that. So that's where my Carnatic journey began. After that, there was no looking back. Then I knew I had to kind of make a choice between whatever I was doing back then, and Carnatic music. So then I dropped everything. I used to, have a finger in a lot of different pies back then. So I used to be part of these jazz fusion groups. I used to be part of these Indian fusion groups, and I used to be a bassist elsewhere, and play a little bit of keyboard here, and then I just said, okay, no, you know what, this is not going to work long term. So I just stopped everything and I just started focusing on Carnatic music, gave a few years of my life to Carnatic music, learning Carnatic music properly. And then, I won't say that the learning has stopped, but yeah, that's how it's been so far.
Yeah, that was a very comprehensive overview of your journey so far. And I'd just like to backtrack a little bit because, there's so much to sort of get into. And just going back to your keyboard beginnings, I find it very interesting how your sort of musical journey starts off with a lot of your own exploration and how you started to discover sounds and relate it to your own emotions, right? So, I don't know, this interval feels like this, that chord feels like that, et cetera, et cetera. And this isn't something that's common in early musical education, at least. It tends to be very sort of technical or you can correct me if I'm wrong or if you disagree, but at least from my experience, emotion is not something that's incorporated into early musical education. So how do you think your early exposure to understanding the emotion behind music, at least to some level, how do you think that influenced your approach to music?
I have not had a formal musical education back when I was growing up. So I've been self-taught until the time that I met U. Srinivas ji and started learning under him. In that sense, I would say my musical education has been very unconventional. I don't know if it's good or bad, but I like what I discovered. I like, the journey that I had with music because it was very hands-on, even though it was probably very scattered, but it was very hands-on and there was a lot of trial and error, so it made me think a lot about what I was doing. So I think kind of sharpened my ears a little bit to whatever extent that it did. And then I think the emotional aspect of it, I don't know how to explain it. It's because emotions are very subjective. So, and sometimes emotions can be even suggested. So if someone tells you a minor chord is unhappy, a major chord is happy,
yeah,
it's like you believe that. But for me, it was like I knew what chord made me feel a certain way. It was very odd, but in my head, there were like, every chord had its color, every chord had its emotion attached. So I was very clear about what things were doing. And then I started discovering these other layers to harmonies, and I was like, oh, this note here added to this gives out this color, so this is nice. And so that's how most of the mental journey was like that for me musically. And of course, I was very, very fortunate to have had exposure right from my childhood to Western classical music, which is very emotionally rich, if you ask me, especially the later works of Mozart and the Beethoven symphonies, even impressionist music or post-impressionist, like, Stravinsky and all. So I used to go to my uncle's place, and he had this huge collection. He had hundreds of CDs of Western classical music, and he had these two huge speakers, which I used to sit next to with my ear, glued to the speaker. I would be listening to these very weird sounds like Igor Stravinsky's Rite of Spring, which is an exceptionally, dissonant.
Yes.
Yeah, but I used to find it relaxing as a kid. I don't know why. If that is a testimony to how disturbed I am as an individual, so be it. But it was beautiful for me. I used to find it very beautiful because nobody was telling me anything. I was discovering everything on my own. Nobody was telling me this is good, this is bad, this is heavy, this is angry, this is happy, this is sad. Everything was being discovered on my own. So I was very happy about it. I mean, upon reflection, I've been very happy about that aspect because then I could form my own imagery of music and then go from there. So even now, I think in my own head, I probably have my own idea of music, and I'm sure it works the same way for everybody else as well. Everyone has a very individualistic approach to music. That's why I've had a lot of fun with my journey because of that. Because it's always been about discovering something, and it still continues to this day. It's always discovering something every day. So that keeps me going. That's what keeps me going on a daily basis.
Yeah, and something I find very interesting is that you've been exposed to a lot of genres since your childhood, and you're quite different in this manner from some of the other guests that I've interviewed, particularly in terms of Carnatic-based fusion artists. I remember talking to Aditya Prakash, who's like a fusion Carnatic vocalist in the United States, and he was telling me how in his childhood he focused completely on Carnatic music. And I think many people who learn under a guru tend to kind of fall under that approach. But you obviously you weren't formally trained and you just explored everything. So from a Carnatic perspective, do you think exposing yourself to different genres of music enhanced your understanding of Carnatic in any way? Or perhaps gave you a different perspective or something like that?
Maybe it did. I don't know, because when it was all happening, I didn't even have time to process it. It was just everything was just happening at the same time. But I'm sure what has happened is it's been very circular in my case. So my habit of listening to different kind of genres of music made it easier for me to pick up the nuances of Carnatic, I think. I'm not sure. So I think it made it easier for me to be able to pick up the nuances of Carnatic music. Since then, though, because Carnatic music is such a vast and such a melodically rich and such a detailed and nuanced form of music, it's helped me with other music as well. So my other music helped Carnatic, and then Carnatic helped my other music. So it's just been a circle that way, It's been very interesting, yeah.
Something you mentioned as you were talking about your sort of musical journey was how you got into the guitar. And your guitar education started in a very unusual way, as you said, because you used to go to your friend's house initially to play cricket, but you'd eventually just play the guitar instead, if I'm correct. So you're sitting with your guitar, which is your true passion, while your friends are outside playing cricket. This might be a slightly pessimistic outlook, but did this ever lead to a feeling of loneliness because you fundamentally had different interests, or was the music enough company for you?
The music was enough company for me. So even to this day, I'm someone who, I want to have t-shirts printed, normalize isolation. So I would get that t-shirt if I could. I don't know. I've always been, I'm an only child. I've not had, I don't have siblings. So I grew up in a pretty isolated manner. And I remember I used to love me time. Even as a child, I used to love spending time alone with my books or my music or my toys or what have you. And I think the same thing kind of carried on into the future, even to this day. I really enjoy my me time. So I don't know what that makes me sound like, but this is who I am. I can't change who I am now. But I really enjoy my own company to that end, because it's something that I've felt that I never get bored on my own. I never get bored. So that, I think, is something that's quite a gift to have, the ability to not getting bored on your own. So I think that helped a lot. So there were times, of course, when I would go to play and then the guitar would kind of keep calling me in my head. So I would purposely get out, match fixing. So I would purposely get out early and then go inside and sit and play while they, for another 2 hours while they would play outside, and come back inside sweaty and dirty. And I'd be sitting inside just playing my guitar. So yeah, that's how it was. I even remember, I used to take my guitar to college, and under the pretense of attending lectures, my college had this. I studied in Ferguson College in Pune, and for those of who have attended that college, they know there's a hill on the back which is part of the campus, which you can climb and go right on top. So I used to go up early morning. I'd sit there on top with my guitar, try and discover as much as possible, till it was time for me to go home and pretend, hey, I attended all my lectures, I'm a good student. So most of my college life was that. I can say that now. To any professor who's listening to this podcast now, my profoundest apologies for bunking your, I'm sure, very valuable lectures, but yeah.
That's brilliant. That's top of the list in terms of musician stories.
Yeah, I'm sure. I really enjoyed that hill. I wish I could go back there again sometime soon.
Yeah, and something that's interesting is that you went to college, and correct me if I'm wrong, but did you have a brief stint in an office job? Is that correct?
I did.
Right?
I did,
okay.
actually.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I've had I wouldn't call it like a conventional office job, but it was still a 9 to 5, and that's the only time in my life I've had a 9 to 5. And this was a firm in Bangalore which very kindly gave me a job, and without any proper qualifications and all that. But I was there for about 2 months, and it was not that the job was bad. The work environment was beautiful. It was, jovial. It was nice. It was positive. But I knew I wanted to, take my music to the stage. And I was already at that point in time where I just wanted to play music on a stage. That's all I wanted to do. I remember this very clearly. It was, I think, June, just before the onset of monsoons in Bangalore. I took a lunch break. Usually lunch break used to be 1 hour, a very generous 1 hour. And I just went for a walk one day, and I just sat on a park bench. I know these sound like cliched romantic movie stories, but trust me, this is very, very true. And I just sat on the park bench for 1 hour, reflecting on my life in slow motion. And I just had to make a decision right then and there. I was like, you know what? I got to call this quits. I got to go back home, and I got to do what I want to do. So when my lunch break was over, I walked into my boss's office and I told her, I don't know if you require me to give you a 1 month's notice, but here's the thing, I gotta do this, I just gotta go for this. So she was very kind enough to let me go right there. No, she didn't fire me. She didn't fire me. She was very encouraging. She was like, I understand if this is what you want to do, then I don't want to be the one holding you back. She was very, very kind about it. And I just came back home. I was living with my aunt in Bangalore back then. I just told them, you know what, this is the thing. I just quit my job and I want to go back to Pune and I want to do a career in music. So I booked my bus tickets just that evening, and the next day I was back home. And yeah, I've been a musician since then.
We're hitting peak musician stories right now. Yeah, and something that I find interesting as well is you've spoken about your really strong passion towards Carnatic, and obviously we're going to get into that in a bit. But your initial foray into professional guitar playing was more in jazz and blues, if I'm correct. So why was this the case?
Yeah. Well, Around the time that I started playing the guitar, Carnatic was not in the picture. Not in terms of a performance. I used to listen to Carnatic, but I never really thought I would end up playing it, which is another thing. I mean, if you'd asked me, say, 15 years ago or 20 years ago, you're going to be a Carnatic, are you going to be a Carnatic performer? I would have been like, no way. So I just didn't see that happening, you know. So I used to listen to a lot of jazz and rock and everything. So I joined these bands which were like rock and alternative rock kind of things. Then I joined these other fusion bands which used to play, which used to dabble. We used to try and do stuff like Mahavishnu and stuff like that, and Remember Shakti and all of that. So I used to be mainly into that earlier, and I did that for about maybe 2 or 3 years before everything just switched in my head, and I went. This is one of those other musician stories, I guess, because I remember late night. I used to sit and practice late night, and one night I was sitting with my guitar. Must have been about 2:30 in the morning, and I was listening to this beautiful ragam aalaap in Hamsadvani by Srinivas ji, and I remember it moved me so much that I just felt very compelled to try it out on the guitar. I don't know why. I just wanted to try this out on the guitar. So I sat that night maybe for a few hours and just tried to do that. Of course, I probably sounded like a cat falling off a building on the guitar, but it sparked, you know, something got sparked that night, and I knew this is something that I wanted to explore very, very deeply and very, very seriously as much as I could. And from that day onwards, I used to sit every day and like along with the rest of my practice, I would kind of try and put in a little bit of Carnatic sliding practice as well. So yeah, back then I was very, very bad. I'm not very good now, but I was really bad back then. I mean, it was very interesting because it was a completely different way of looking at the guitar. Everything changed about the guitar that, you know, from that time onwards, and it was almost like the guitar had started becoming a fretless instrument, and I started looking at the guitar in terms completely of ragas. So everything that was being mapped visually on the guitar started becoming ragas. Everything that was mapped internally started becoming ragas, and yeah, everything switched in my head. So yeah, it's been like that ever since.
Yeah, and speaking of the switch, I'd like to get into that switch and talk about your time learning under the one and only Shri Mandolin Srinivas, who's one of my favorite instrumentalists of all time. And I think that's what really attracted me to your music as well. So yeah, you went to Chennai to learn under Mandolin Srinivas ji. But I find it interesting because at the time, there's also another very prominent Carnatic guitarist who's Prasanna sir. He's, you know, incredible in all of his own ways. So what drove you to learn from somebody who played from a different instrument to you compared to perhaps the alternative of learning directly under a Carnatic guitarist?
I think it was his musical language, you know, Srinivas ji's musical language that first attracted me to him. When I heard his thought process, his expression, the way he dealt with certain ragas, and the way he, you know, explored certain ragas, that language just appealed to me, and I just had to get, you know, as familiar with it as possible. Of course, it's an ocean, and I'm just skimming on the surface with like a raft, but it's something that has always resonated with me inside. Obviously, I mean, this is not a commentary on Prasanna sir's playing. It's very different, and it's beautiful in its own way. But when I was listening to music, I grew up and you know, listening to Mandolin Srinivas, and that it just was there with me for a very long time. And then I used to listen extensively to Remember Shakti, and I really liked what Shakti were doing with fusion music back then. It was something different. So all of that put together, it was, for me, it was a no-brainer that if I learned from someone, it had to be him, because I always looked up to him. Even when I was doing my experiments on guitar, it was always with reference to his recordings. So I would always put his recordings and try to emulate that tone or that language, that approach to music. You know, it just struck deep inside. That's all it was.
Yeah, and under Mandolin Srinivas sir, you learned what's called the bunny style of playing. And today, sorry.
Yeah. So you could say
Yeah.
it's like, I mean, in Carnatic there's no gharana system, as you
Mm.
know, like there is in Hindustani classical. But what I like to say, there's no official thing maybe, but I like to call it the Yushanivas Bani because it's a very particular way of dealing with the raga. It's a very particular approach to musical thinking. So I like to try as much as possible with my own limited understanding and my limited capacities to try and take that legacy forward, especially since we've been very unfortunate to have been robbed of his presence on earth. But I want to try and take that legacy, that form of thinking forward. So I'm trying to pass it on to my students as well, as much as is possible from my end.
Yeah, so I was just wondering, like, what separates his style of playing? What makes it so distinct, do you think, having learned under him?
I think it's just, this is probably a very unscientific and esoteric approach to what I think is the answer to this question. I think what he was as a person just shone through his music. It just exploded through his music because he was a very, very gentle person, but he was an extremely sharp and an extremely intelligent person. And his music is the greatest testimony to him as a person. And I think that's what shines through when you listen to any of his live recordings or even his studio recordings, or if you've attended any of his live concerts. His spontaneity, his joy, his happiness, his innocence with the instrument, and his intellect, energetic but still emotionally rich approach to any raga or any kind of improv or any even compositions, that he had his own style of delivering or interpreting actually any of the established compositions of Carnatic classical music. So that is what I think is his appeal most of all to most people. I mean, you and I, we're both great fans of Srinivas and we somewhere, deep down inside, we know that that's what kind of separates him from the pack. And yeah, I think that's what it is.
Yeah, and as I was preparing for this interview, I happened to come across a few clips of him teaching, and something that really struck me in the videos I saw was that he was never really teaching the notes, but rather he relied on the students to have such a strong understanding of their instrument to be able to replicate what he played. So yeah, I don't know if he played, sarigarisa, he wouldn't say sarigarisa, like he'd just play it and then he'd expect the student to understand, okay, it's sarigarisa. Okay, I'll play sarigarisa. That requires a really strong understanding of your instrument. And to be honest, like I wouldn't be able to keep up to, I think, if I were a student there. So was this ever a struggle, or were your ears so well trained that this was never really an issue?
I think, I mean, I might have had a slight advantage because I was already a professional musician by then. So I'm sure that came in good stead to a certain extent. But even then, I think the way he taught was so beautiful and was so simple and was so straightforward that the one thing that I really, when I reflect upon my time with Srinivas ji, the one thing that really strikes me is more than teaching me, he taught me how to learn really well. And I think that's something that I'm pretty sure all of his students, my co-students, my co-disciples would agree with as well. He taught in such a way that it became, you as a student became very intuitive to learning, became very sharp and became very alert to learning. So even to this day, I don't have any, I don't have a single written note. There's no notebook, or there's nothing written on paper that he
Oh,
taught me.
wow.
It's all been, from guru to student, in terms of memory, in terms of listening, and that way. So I remember, like, anything complicated, he would break it down and he would teach it, but he would never, sit and say out. I mean, at least personally with me, he didn't. The sari girl, like you said, he would just play it and he would rely on our ability to understand the reference note and understand which note is being played, which note is being treated how. And he really taught us to pick up on that really well. So I think that was his strongest. And one more thing I have to mention, he had a beautiful sense of humor. So the sessions would always be very light and very, I don't know if I should say this, but it was very non toxic, because there are a
Hmm.
lot of student teacher relationships that can tend to get a little toxic sometimes, and especially like in the kind of environment that we are in today, we need to talk about these kind of things. And it's something that I personally also try and follow as much as possible, is not to bring any kind of toxicity between a student and a teacher, because then I believe that really hampers learning in the long term. uh, that was something that he used to practice so beautifully. He would never yell, he would never ridicule, he would never be condescending, and he would never show any kind of signs of impatience. So that made the learning so much more beautiful than it already was. Just being in the presence of a legend like him, it just made it so much more beautiful than that.
Yeah, and speaking of, yourself and Mandolin Srinivas, sir, there's a commonality that I find interesting among many sort of Carnatic guitar and mandolin players in general. And that's that the electric versions of your instrument tend to be more commonly played compared to the acoustic ones. And I've seen you play the acoustic guitar as well, so I know you can, but you generally tend to use the electric guitar for Carnatic, and Mandolin Srinivas tended to use the electric mandolin instead of an acoustic one. So why do you think there's a general preference for the electric instruments rather than the acoustic ones in Carnatic? Is it just a matter of amplification, or is there something more than that?
Amplification definitely is one of the factors, but apart from that, I think it's the tonal control that you get with an electric instrument, which you don't get to that extent on an acoustic instrument, because it's already kind of set with what it has. But one more thing that you get with the electric instrument is the kind of sustain that you get. So you can make the tanams, you can make the phrases sound a little more, seamless, and you can control the tone, you can control the dynamics a little better within the context of Carnatic classical music with an electric instrument rather than an acoustic. I mean, having said that, I wouldn't say that an acoustic is not capable of playing Carnatic. In fact, I really like playing Carnatic music on an acoustic. It really has a very primal and a raw flavor. But for recording contexts, and especially for live concert contexts, I feel that the electric lends itself better to this form of music than the acoustic.
And there's again, as I was preparing for this, I came across this paper about sort of Carnatic guitar and mandolin playing, and something that I read in that is, something that I hadn't consciously noticed. But for example, when you play a traditional Carnatic string instrument like the veena, for example, you produce gamakams through bending, right? So you play and then you bend the string. But
Yeah.
Mandolin Chinosa kind of reversed that trend. He didn't bend as much, but there was a lot of sliding.
Yeah,
And
because these instruments you can't really bend. The guitar and the mandolin, they don't lend themselves to bending so much. Not the kind of levels to which Carnatic music requires bending. Even though, I mean, on a guitar you can bend notes to a certain degree, but not it won't have the kind of freedom to be able to pull out the exact gamakas that are there in Carnatic. So the style obviously had to change to adapt to be able to play all the gamakas that were necessary for Carnatic music without diluting the music in any way, without affecting the traditional aspect of or the aesthetics of the music. So the sliding kind of becomes our bending. It's the equivalent of the veena bending. So we slide the instrument. So now we have to try and use our finger pressures in such a way as to not make it sound noisy or not make the frets sound very prominent or something. So that's part of the process of being able to try and bring that aesthetic to the front, to make it sound as rounded as possible, to make it sound as beautiful as possible, without because the guitar is not an instrument that was made for Carnatic music. It was made for completely different reasons, and the
yeah.
guitar, but it's that's what I love about the guitar. It's just you name it and it can be used in that context. Anything, absolutely anything, from Western classical to blues to jazz to rock to metal and to Latin music to Hindustani classical as well, and now Carnatic classical. So I don't think there's a single genre of music that the guitar has not been part of. And that, I think, is the beauty of that instrument, which is why I want to try and bring it as much as possible to the mainstream Carnatic music as today the violin is, because the violin itself was not an instrument that was. I mean, the violin is it's a European instrument,
Yeah.
and it was about 250 years ago that Muthuswami Dikshitar, first brought the violin to the Carnatic context, and since then it's been like a staple. It's violin is to Carnatic music what the harmonium is to Hindustani classical music. Interestingly, the harmonium as well is not an Indian instrument; it's a European instrument. So yeah, so that's what I like. I mean, these instruments just being able to adapt themselves to this music is it's very interesting, because it makes the world a smaller and a more beautiful place in my tiny little head.
Yeah, it is very interesting when I think it's more common that melodic instruments tend to come in from other cultures into Carnatic. I think the
Definitely.
percussion has stayed largely consistent.
Yeah, percussion has stayed largely traditional
Mm.
so far. Although, I mean, a lot of people are now incorporating Carnatic elements onto
Yeah.
drums or other instruments, other Western instruments. But for the context of the Carnatic concert itself, the traditional Carnatic kacheri, as we call it, it's still a very traditional. Percussively, it's still a very traditional scenario.
Mm. And you mentioned that one of your goals is to try and bring the Carnatic guitar to the mainstream, to a larger audience. And one way through which you've done that is through your album, and your album which released in June. And I'd like to talk about that because it's what got me interested in you as a musician. It was my first sort of insight into your work, and I loved it. And then the rabbit hole began from there. So so yeah, your debut album titled your name, titled Abhay Nayampally.
That, that's because we just got lazy. We didn't know what to call it. So, let's just leave it at the artist name for now.
It's a name that's easy to remember for sure.
Yeah. No, but I joke a lot. Actually, it was my producer, Sandeep Chota,
Mm.
the maestro himself. It was his idea to call it Abhay Nayampally. I had a slew of different, all kinds of wacky names to put the first album. And he just said, you know what, let's just call it Abhay Nayampally, because you're being introduced to the world from this in this way. I mean, people know you as a concert artist, but this is something different. So let's just call it this, because you're opening yourself up to a larger audience now. It's because when you release an album, it's putting your music out on a global platform. So your name needs to be first known. So when we do the second album, you can call it whatever wacky names you think of, but let's just keep the first album at Abhay Nayampally, which I mean, it resonated, and then yeah, we just went with that.
Something that I find quite interesting in the album is in many songs, or pretty much all songs, there's a link between the song title and the content of the song itself. Now, in most music, we take that as a given because in lyrics it'll just come up. But in
Yeah.
instrumental music, it tends to be a bit more hazy. But I think the connection is quite clear. Celebration sounds like a celebration. um ex animo sounds like it's something that comes from the heart. So with these songs, did a target mood inspire the compositions, or did the composition inspire the title?
In most of the cases, the composition kind of inspired the title, because we
Mm.
were just going with. I mean, I was just making the music, and then I wasn't really thinking of titles, and then we had to upload the music, and then I was like, "Oh, we need names for this. We can't just call it track 1, 2, 3, 4, 5." So that's how the title. But we didn't want to make it very random. So that's how. So now hear this, because it was my way of saying, okay, you've heard Hamsadvani all these years, and I want to try and show it in a different color. So now hear
Mm.
this. So that's how that happened. Ex Animo kind of happened because when I was recording it, the thought behind it was, this is something that is closest to me as a form of music, and this is I mean, Ex Animo was the track that I kept as traditionally Carnatic as possible. So that was my, it was a big chunk of my heart being put out there. So that's why it became From the Heart, and the Latin for From the Heart is ex animo. So we decided to call it ex animo. And then Ballad of Krishna, it's almost
Yeah.
self-explanatory, because it was a form of jazz ballad that, I mean, I love the format of jazz ballads, and I wanted to do something mixing the jazz ballad with Carnatic classical. So that's what Ballad of Krishna is, because I just took the very famous composition Krishnani Begane Baro and tried to interpret it in the context of a jazz ballad. So that became Ballad of Krishna. Celebration became Celebration because, I mean, this was a beautiful track that was composed by Sandeep Chauta himself.
Oh,
And
really? Okay.
he was very kind to entrust that composition to me. Yeah, so we just had a ball with this composition, and we had so many international artists playing on it. I mean, we have the famous Bakiti Kumalo, who was famous for Paul Simon's Graceland, and it was such an honor to have him playing the bass for this. We have Seb Reed playing the bass on the reprise version. We have Diego Hedges from Cuba playing the trumpet on the reprise version. We have Hector Moreno playing the keys on the original Celebration version. And we had such a slew of such talented and amazing artists playing it. It really felt like a celebration of music, because it was a bunch of people sitting across the globe who were stuck in their homes with nothing to do but make music. So we decided, okay, you know what, let's just celebrate that we at least have music that brings us together, even through all these really weird and confusing times. So Celebration became that. And then Use actually was the last one to be named. I think Use was named because the kind of harmonies that I've used for that composition, it's a composition in a traditional Carnatic raga called Abheri, but
Yeah.
I wanted to kind of make it sound different with the kind of colors that are there for the harmonies that are there, especially in the opening. So it kind of, shot off these different colors of Abheri as you're listening to it. So I wanted to show that, and I wanted to show how many different ways you could, incorporate the concept of guitar in Abheri. So
Mm.
there is my regular sound, then there's that overdrive-ish kind of rockish kind of sound.
Yeah. Yeah.
I've played a solo in, so I had to think differently for that. So that becomes another color for the raga. Then there's a bass guitar solo in Abheri that I've played on the track itself. So all of these different colors put together, it just, it was a no-brainer to call it Use. So
Yeah, it for sure that's definitely something that stuck out to me because I mean Aberi in fusion is quite common, everybody plays Nagumomu in fusion. but the way you presented it was really unique and it was I loved it. Yeah.
thank you.
And the way certain tracks flow, especially a song like Ex Animal, for example, it comes across as very improvisational, but also very kind of it's together. It's not just like something is doing its own thing. The keys and pads line up really well with the sort of improvised guitar lines. So how much of it is improvised and how much of it is kind of preconceived and pre-composed?
The actual, I mean, the guitar parts on Exanimo were completely improvised, because all I did was just treat it as a ragam in Madhyamavati.
Mm.
And for those who may not know, Madhyamavati is considered like a very auspicious raga in Carnatic music. So I thought it kind of felt fitting to include a Madhyamavati in my debut album. So I just wanted to kind of put out one track that would be just purely Carnatic and would be just purely a ragam, nothing else, no rhythm, no nothing. So Madhyamavati was the best choice for that. So the guitar parts in that are completely improvised from start to end. And then the pads kind of, I wanted to add these layers underneath and make it kind of, give it a little bit of weight from underneath where it was empty. Because instead of adding a typical tanpura, I said, let me add a tanpura along with these keys and, kind of give it a little weight from the lower end.
Yeah, and I think that's probably my like personal favorite from the album. And I don't know, for some reason, Madhyamavati, I've never thought of it as and this is just me being super superficial and judgmental, but I've never really thought of it as, a particularly kind of emotionally rich rag. I shouldn't say that, but like at least maybe compared to other ragams, it's not something that's hit me as much. But then I heard this, and I'm like, I need to listen to way more of this ragam. I've missed out on something big here.
Well, I'm really pleased if it makes you think that. I mean, that's the whole idea of putting music out there. So everybody has their own journey with music, and if it can incite something beautiful in someone, then I think that's a win right there. So I'm very pleased, and thank you for sharing that thought with me. That's very beautiful. So thank you.
Yeah, and obviously this album is one that's centered around Carnatic music and essentially putting it into different contexts and helping Carnatic music evolve. And I found something that you said in a recent Instagram live stream quite interesting, how you felt that classical music was getting diluted and dumbed down. Just out of curiosity, what is making you feel this way?
I think for one, people's patience has been thinned out because of a lot of things. And one thing is there's this constant bombardment of everything right now because of social media and the internet. And so there is a level of saturation that has reached. And I call it the T20ization of music because earlier we could have these time slots where you could do a 4 hour Carnatic concert or you could do a 5 hour, and people would sit through. People, throngs would sit through, and those who didn't get a seat to sit would stand and watch, and they would watch the entire time. But people's patience is running out. So what is happening, unfortunately, is even in the context of concerts, once long a few decades ago when we used to do concerts before the pandemic hit, it was, you know we were told to kind of compress everything into, like, 1 hour or 1.5 hours, and it becomes difficult to kind of present a complete picture of Carnatic classical or even Hindustani classical for that matter. It's like trying to say, you got Beethoven's Ninth Symphony, but you got to finish it in a half an hour. It just doesn't work that way. It doesn't. It wasn't written for that. So I think because of that, there's been a lot of compression. There's been a lot of. Now, I'm not saying we should not be approachable. I for one, am all for being approachable to newer audiences all the time and bringing it to an audience who may not know Carnatic music. So I don't mind the simplification of it, but I don't know. It's a little unfortunate that people's patience is running out, so people don't have the patience to sit through maybe say a 10-minute aalaap or something. So that's why, like, even Instagram reels and everything. Like earlier, I used to make longer videos, but then you find that people don't have the patience to sit through. So now it's come down to like 15 seconds and 30 seconds, but that will definitely dilute thought and approach and improvisation to a certain degree. And I think that's probably what is going on with music right now. I hope it's just a phase that we are going through, but we'd be the poorer if this was to continue in a more permanent fashion. That's what I feel about it. I don't know. It's a personal thing.
Yeah, and I think the question I'm trying to kind of lead this to and how it connects with your album, for example, is I think your album is a perfect example of the evolution of music, how you're putting this traditional form of music into various different contexts. But something that kind of struck me over the past few weeks is I'm unable to differentiate between evolution and dilution, even though one has a very positive connotation and another has a very negative connotation. There's something in me that feels that a form of dilution is necessary in order for evolution to happen. So, as if something negative needs to happen in order for something positive to happen. I'm not sure if my thought process is correct, and that's something I'm kind of battling with within myself. But do you think so? Do you think some form of dilution is necessary for evolution?
I think that's a very interesting thought. Maybe to a certain extent. I mean, we do need to adapt. So we do need to adapt for music to evolve in some way. So maybe to a certain extent. But dilution, when I use the term dilution, I'm talking of it in terms of, like, I mean, maybe not classical music so much as other forms of music where complexities are just, being done away with for the sake of the tastes of a few certain. I don't know if this is politically correct to say, but we all know that this happens, and I'm just going to be the one who's going to say it. But we have all these companies that music companies and all that kind of dictate creative directions, and that is what I feel is what dilutes a lot of the music in terms of complexities, in terms of richness, because they want to kind of keep it safe. Nobody wants to kind of take a risk with anything new or something, and that's what I loved about Sandeep Chota's approach to music and his platform, his label Nama Music, is there is no creative interference on any level at all. There is absolute freedom, and you just the brief is just go nuts with this. That's the brief. Just go nuts with it, and that's what speaks volumes for that label, because it brought out so much rich content in such a short time. I mean, 25 albums in a span of a year and a half is massive. I mean, this needs to be, I don't know, this needs to go in some kind of record book, I feel. But anyway, coming back to my point, I feel for evolution of music, definitely things need to change. I mean, you see it happening through time. I mean, you study any form of art and you see it happening through time. Something, a different thought process gives birth to something new. And I mean, it happened with the Renaissance, it happened with the Impressionist movement, it happened with music going from classical, Western classical music going from the classical system to the romantic system, where music changed from romantic to the Impressionist, and all of that. Music has always been evolving, and Carnatic music itself has always been evolving. Even the concert format of Carnatic is not what it used to be maybe 150 years ago. So evolution is definitely necessary. I find that if we can keep evolution with the richness and the complexity and the beauty and the aesthetics of music intact. I mean, I'm not even saying like, I've just taken, it's a Carnatic album and I've just taken one Carnatic composition in it, Krishnani Begane Baro. Other than that, I'm just, but we try to keep it as beautiful as possible without, trying to, for lack of a better phrase, dumb it down. For lack of a better phrase,
Yeah.
actually.
No, I agree. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so I mean, there's so many sort of musical, I don't know, explorations that you've delved into, and your main one for sure has been with Carnatic guitar, but you're far from limited to that. And recently, you actually turned into a film score with the short film Saffron, and with your album, everything was centered around your Carnatic guitar. But I imagine you had to venture away from that with your film score, at least a little bit. So, how much did you have to go outside of your comfort zone for this project?
If I must be very honest, I was well within my comfort zone here, because I grew. I'll tell you why. I'll tell you why. I'm not trying to sound boastful, but I have weird fetish for soundtracks, background scores,
Mm.
and I've grown up on these. I've grown up on John Williams. I've grown up on Hans Zimmer, on Alan Menken, on Alan Silvestri, all of them. So many names. I can't even remember them now. But yeah, my main musical diet when I was growing up was one of the main musical diets was background scores. So doing something like this was like, oh wow, finally I can get to do something like this. I mean, obviously these guys are like the kings of it, and I'm probably one of the cobblers on the street trying to do it. But
No.
but it was so interesting, that entire concept of looking at a scene, looking at a screen, and then thinking of music where that empty space is. It was so interesting. And I mean, I thought, okay, maybe let's see if Carnatic guitar goes in this. And it didn't. I tried. It didn't. So I just left it aside. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. There's no compulsion that it has to be there. So the score then became primarily like a Western score. It became so there are no Carnatic elements at all in the score that I've composed for Saffron, and I think that's largely because of all the music that I'd listened to for all of these decades, and all of that kind of came in handy now. All that reference and all that. So I really have to thank all these masters for giving that volume of music to the world, where we can find that inspiration and take from that and go ahead from there.
Mm. Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, I'm just, as we start to wrap up this episode, I'm just kind of touching on the other aspects of you as not only as a musician, but also as a person. And I'm also aware that another kind of strong, avid interest of yours is reading books. And that's another kind of source of creativity, another source of ideas. How much do you think resorting to something outside music helps you in terms of the creative impetus? Do you think it gives you something fresh in any way, or is your interest in books kind of separate from music?
It depends on what I'm reading at that time. If I'm reading something about art, then definitely it helps with music, it helps with inspiration, it helps with approach, it helps with understanding thought better. Because, I mean, all we do is try and understand. The universe is confusing at best. And and all we can try and do is try and maybe get a kernel of comprehension somewhere along the way in our journeys, and that's all I'm trying to do. I'm just a guy, trying to understand how it all works, what's led us to being where we are today, from being that tiny single cell organism that we once were a few years ago. So reading, definitely, I mean, especially if I'm reading about art, that definitely helps with my music. But I feel everything, no matter what you do, it kind of helps with, at least in my case, it helps with my music. I find inspiration in the weirdest of places. So whether it's reading or whether it's even sports, I find inspiration, and even, a lot of help when, like, I'm very fond of sim racing. That's an arena that I've been avidly taking an interest in over the last few years. And I realized that sim racing actually helped my musical skills grow, which is very weird, but it actually happened. It's
Oh,
yeah, I don't
how
I don't know,
so?
but it
I'm just
in
curious.
terms of mental reflexes, in terms of physical speed on the fretboard, it
Mhm.
just sped everything up. Not that speed is everything in music, but
Yeah.
it's a skill set that really helped in developing, faster thought processes and being able to look at something in slow motion. So that is something that I noticed, and I found that very interesting, that this is something which is completely disconnected from music, and yet it has, so many connections that you can draw into music, and so many things that you can take from it into music.
Yeah, all right. So that kind of wraps things up in terms of questions that I wanted to cover and the kind of conversational part of this interview. But obviously you are an incredible musician, and the magic that comes out of your fingertips is something that nobody wants to miss. So if you don't mind, if you do have your guitar on hand, perhaps.
So I just thought maybe I could just play some ragam for you, since we don't have any
Yes.
kind of accompaniment. I could just play a little bit of. What would you like me to play? Is there a
Eh,
particular?
do you mind if I give a recommendation?
Yeah, sure.
You did post a 1 minute noodle of this ragam, but it's my favorite ragam, and it's a trademark ragam of Mandolin Srinivas sir, Charukesi.
Oh, beautiful. Yeah, I would love to attempt that.
Yeah.
Let's.
Thank you so much. And before we finish, I have a trademark sort of final question that I ask every guest that comes on. It's nothing too special, but it's kind of become tradition here. So the question is, what's on your playlist right now?
Oh, so many different things. So I'm going through a bit of a Claude Debussy phase, re-going through that actually. So I'm just kind of listening to all of his music in a new headspace, with a new context, and I've been kind of studying his music a little bit. So I've been listening to his music a lot. I've been listening to a lot of Alan Holdsworth. That's always on my playlist. I think that man has the most beautiful. That man had the most beautiful brain among guitarists I've ever seen. So there's always a little bit of Alan Holdsworth on my playlist. There's of course a lot of Srinivas ji on my playlist, always, every day. It's that learning never stops. Then today I was listening to Fazil Say's Beethoven piano sonatas. I just rediscovered these recordings on a streaming platform, and they're really really beautiful piano sonatas. His interpretation of it, so that's there. Then of course I love to listen to a lot of classic rock. So there's the Doors, Pink Floyd, there's the Who, Beatles. Yeah, that's right now most of what is on my playlist. Apart from background scores like Hans Zimmer, Ludwig Göransson, John Williams, I've been listening to a lot of Göransson's work on the background score of Tenet, Christopher Nolan's latest movie. It's some really interesting stuff that he's conceptualized for that movie. So yeah, that's on my playlist right now.
Sounds great. So yeah, lots of music for us and the listeners to check out for sure. So yeah, that kind of wraps things up for this episode. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you to the listeners for tuning in. And I'll leave all of Abhay's social media links and streaming platform links and all that in the description. So make sure to check all of that out. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Nishad, for having me. This was a beautiful, beautiful conversation, and we'll be in touch. Hope to talk to you more.
Well, that was Abhay Nayampally on our 12th episode of the Indoencers Podcast, and thank you to everyone that has tuned in. You can find us at the Indoencers, spelled THEINDOENCERS, on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram, or you can use the links in the description. Likewise, you can find our homepage at theindoencers.wordpress.com or through the link in the description. Make sure to subscribe to the Indoencers Podcast on your favorite podcasting platform. Thank you once again, and we'll see you next time.